Hello, I'm Marina Fortier, and this is my video journal for Chapter 1. The first question is a horror genre political? I would say yes. Art is political. Horror is a part of art. It's part of literature. It's a part of cinema, and a plethora of other things. I think that art, broadly, including horror, is political because an artist and a creator are also products of the conditions that they're raised in. They're a product of cultural conditions, traditionalism, um, their physical health. Basically, the whole realm of the human experience can contribute to how someone creates art and what manifests within their art. And with that said, we also have expectations, assumptions, and biases that will influence the work that we create. I think that in itself is political, and you're taking a stand against something whether you know it or not. So it's kind of a responsibility to um, be considerate with your work. I think horror is able to tackle real life issues through a subversive means. Um, for example, monsters are usually a metaphysical representation of a problem or a fear. And because of that, you can be really subversive, telling narratives that are perfect to be political allegories or go against social authorities. Um, it's a great way that you can say what you want to say with as little as a voice you have under oppressive powers. Um, I think Worland agrees with this. He writes, recent commentators would agree that the psychological and social implications of the genre are closely related, even inseparable, um, reasoning that the individual is a subject of social formation and conditioning, whose personal responses must be mapped onto larger social questions raised by horror as entertainment. That's from the Kindle location 140 to 141. Um, I think that kind of backs up my idea that um, there's always going to be implications of what you create in horror as uh, a medium that seeks to find reaction has weight, and what message we're sending is created by the person that we are and have been formed by the outside world. For number two, uh, yes, I do agree that with how Warland defines a horror film. Um, to begin, I kind of want to just summarize how Warland defines a horror film. Um, he says how the horror genre is defined by the emotional response it provokes, usually apprehension, fear, and terror. Location 137 to 138. Um, he also says how horror evokes deeper, more personal psychological fears in the starkest terms. The most basic fear of the horror story is the fear of death, and that's from 147 to 148. Um, so I think those are two features of horror genre that I agree with. He also says how horror is distinguished as the opposite of restraint. Horror is an emotionally overwhelming form that produces not merely anxiety but revulsion, a sensation that might be literally stomach churning. Explicit scenes of gory violence and the decay of the grave paraded into view. I love that quote. That's from location 202 to 203. So yes, I agree. Horror. It's a really big question to ask. What is horror? But Warland summarizes it pretty well and kind of goes over the beats of the genre. Um, Cinema is a majorly visual medium. Um, Sound will become prominent, but a lot of what you experience is visual. So horror's show don't tell ideology is really effective. You know, horror is sensational. Um, Breaking that down, sensation and reaction, that kind of gives it as a medium and as a genre strength because it can elicit strong reactions, and that gives it a lot of power as an art form. I also wanted to mention that I think that the only way I would kind of disagree with Warland would be I think horror has been reclaimed recently by the people who used to be victimized in it. So those beats and patterns are kind of being broken. For example, like women, people of color, and gay communities are finding more of a solid foothold in horror now as a way to be subversive and challenge the status quo and the heteronormative quo. So the genre is a lot more fluid now than I would say it used to be. Um, Number three, high art versus low art. Um, I wanted to argue that it's not very helpful to have to categorize something into high art or low art. I'll get into that. But first, I'd like to bring up a quote from the book. Worland writes, "Yet how then to reconcile serious considerations with a positively thrilling sense of partaking in something that is low, vulgar, and oppressive, offensive to paternalistic authority? The things that more often than not give horror film its charge and appeal." That's from location 118 to 119, which I think ties into the concept of sensationalism and shock value. Um, he kind of highlights how this sense of vulgarity and lowness is kind of challenging to authority, which also gives it strength. Um, for critics and Werlin, the film versions of Frankenstein, Dracula, and Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde are considered high art or higher value art because they're ripe for analysis. Um, they have their roots in 19th century novels, and that gives it literary cachet. That's from Kindle 106 to 107. And lowbrow would probably be considered I Was a Teenage Frankenstein or Billy the Kid versus Dracula, which is mentioned as um, more juvenile forms of cinema. So, on to my opinion, I think that categorizing is not helpful. Um, I think trying to deem a piece of art good or bad is kind of like a colonialist or Western supremacist concept, um, because there's no way that you can objectively determine something's goodness or badness, especially because you didn't grow up exactly as you weren't conditioned exactly as the author might be, so maybe you just don't understand it. I think just like that humility is really important for talking about art. And I think that considering something lowbrow or highbrow isn't helpful also because art is what you make it. Um, it's not completely about artist intention or artist effort. It's something